They told you it was a peaceful place, a holy land, a beacon of spiritual light in the American wilderness. But the wind carries whispers through the rotting beams of Pleasant Hill, and if you listen long enough, you'll hear them. Don't drink this, see where the others went. That voice, it's not in your head. It's the sound of 412 people, lost across 25 years, never seen again. Their names erased, their graves unmarked, their stories buried beneath layers of righteous silence and government neglect. This wasn't just a religious community. This was a closed system of control, a prototype for modern psychological prisons, the kind that doesn't need walls to keep you in. Just faith, fear, and family. Pleasant Hill, Kentucky. The name itself was the mask. Behind it, a network of watchers. Mothers turned informants, fathers turned wardens, and at the heart of it all, a single family, the Richardsons. A bloodline so deeply embedded in both scripture and strategy that even local sheriffs called them God's hands. They called it love. They called it service. But behind locked doors, it was indoctrination, exploitation, and control on a scale that today's institutions can only admire. And here's the part they never wanted you to know. The state of Kentucky sealed the records. Sealed. Not burned, not destroyed. Sealed. Which means someone, somewhere, still believes this place was worth protecting. Maybe because what happened here didn't end here. Maybe Pleasant Hill was just the beginning, a laboratory for obedience. And if you think that's just history, look at the cameras in your home, the swipe cards at your job, the personalized content they spoon-feed you every hour. Pleasant Hill didn't vanish. It evolved. And today, its spirit lives inside systems you've come to trust. Welcome to Grave Past. Let me show you what they buried.
You're not trapped because of chains. You're trapped because you no longer remember what freedom felt like. That was the first truth the Richardson family understood and exploited. Pleasant Hill didn't need guards at the gates. It didn't need fences. It had something far stronger. Belief. Belief in righteousness. Belief in purity. Belief that obedience was holy and questioning was sin. From the moment a convert stepped onto that land, they began to disappear. Not physically, not yet, but piece by piece. They took your name first. You weren't John anymore. You were Brother John, Sister Mary, titles that sounded warm, spiritual. But what they really did was begin the erasure of the self. Next, they took your possessions, your clothes, your savings, your past letters, your family photographs, all surrendered in the name of divine equality. What they were really doing was breaking the anchors that tied you to your previous life. And then they took your time. Days scheduled to the minute. Wake at 4:30, pray by 5, labor until dusk. No private thought, no private space. The few hours not spent working were spent singing hymns of submission, repenting for imagined sins, and listening to sermons about the dangers of individual will. You didn't even notice that your thoughts weren't your own anymore. That's the brilliance of it. Control wasn't maintained through violence, not at first. It was maintained through ritualized self-erasure. This wasn't a religious community. It was a test site for psychological reprogramming. And at the center of it, the Richardson family didn't just teach control. They embodied it. Elder Samuel, calm, devout, measured. But behind those cold gray eyes lived a man obsessed with structure, lineage, and permanence. Sister Martha, soft-spoken, nurturing. But ask any member privately and they'd say she knew your doubts before you spoke them aloud. Their children weren't just family. They were command units, overseers, watchers, enforcers. You didn't escape Pleasant Hill. You conformed, or you vanished. And once the machine labeled you a liability, Your name disappeared from the rolls, your belongings redistributed. You were spoken of once in prayer, then never again. That's not religion. That's a total control system disguised as salvation. And it works so well, it still echoes in the systems that govern you now. You've seen silence before, but you've never seen the kind that suffocates the mind. That's what the retreat cabins were for. In Pleasant Hill, if you started asking too many questions, if your faith wavered, if your gaze lingered too long on the wrong face, you were invited to retreat. Sounds peaceful, doesn't it? A place to fast, reflect, purify your thoughts. But the truth was darker than the thickest Kentucky night. There were 6 cabins scattered across the outer edge of Pleasant Hill's sprawling farmland. Beautiful on the outside. Wooden porches, stone chimneys, quilted beds. But inside, no mirrors, no clocks, no books. Just silence, surveillance, and scripture. You weren't sent there to heal. You were sent there to be undone, piece by piece. No one ever stayed less than 7 days. Some never came back. The official story? He left to join a neighboring commune. She felt called to serve in Ohio. But there are no letters, no confirmations, no records, only whispers. Sister Patience, the youngest Richardson daughter, controlled all correspondence. She could replicate anyone's handwriting. Forged letters home told families their loved ones were happy, devoted, flourishing. Meanwhile, Brother Caleb was the one who locked the cabin door. He watched, waited, listened, not for prayer, but for submission. You weren't allowed food until you recited scripture with full conviction. You weren't allowed sleep until your confession included the words, "I was wrong to doubt." Some broke within a day, others took longer, but everyone broke eventually. And if you didn't, that's when Sister Hannah brought the bitter root tea, a concoction known only to her, said to purge spiritual confusion. But former members described violent tremors, hallucinations, and memory gaps that lasted for days after drinking it. Most returned from retreat quiet, eyes lower, mouths careful, but different. Like the soul had been burned clean. You see, Pleasant Hill didn't need executions. They'd found something more effective. Psychological death. When your inner voice becomes theirs, they own you. And what they tested in those cabins? It was later mirrored in mental institutions, interrogation chambers, and even modern rehabilitation centers. This wasn't history. This was a manual for turning men into tools. And it worked. Better than anyone dared imagine. You don't need microphones when every mouth fears its own echo. You don't need cameras when every pair of eyes reports to the same God. At Pleasant Hill, the Richardson family mastered surveillance before technology existed. This wasn't a community, it was a living organism, and every member, a cell monitored, tracked, and cataloged. Nothing escaped the invisible eyes. Conversations were never private, rooms were never truly empty. Thoughts, even unspoken, felt exposed. Why? Because every member had been rewired to report. They called it spiritual accountability, but it was behavioral data mining, 200 years before Silicon Valley made it efficient. Sister Rebecca Richardson, cold and clinical, oversaw what they called reflections. Each evening, members were required to submit a verbal report to her, who they spoke to, what they thought about during prayer, what temptations crossed their minds while working. She asked questions like, "When Brother Samuel spoke, did you feel resistance? What image came to you during silent prayer?" And if your answers were inconsistent across days, she'd know. She remembered everything. She kept logs, names, timestamps, emotional tones, even suspected internal doubt. Think about that. Your internal doubt, documented. It wasn't enough to obey. You had to believe. And if you couldn't believe, you had to perform belief flawlessly, or you were marked. These reports went to Elder Samuel and Sister Martha, who conducted nightly reviews. They didn't just know your actions, they knew your patterns, your routines, your weak points. It was the blueprint for algorithmic control, before electricity ever touched Kentucky soil. Today, we live inside digital systems that replicate these same mechanisms. You tell the algorithm what you like, it feeds you more. You speak a word near your phone and it shows up in your feed. But Pleasant Hill didn't need tech. They had belief, fear, ritual. They didn't monitor your device. They programmed your soul to self-report. And when a man loses the privacy of his own mind, he is no longer a man. He's a reflection of what someone else wants him to be. Now, ask yourself, how different is your world really? Or are we all living in a larger, cleaner, quieter version of Pleasant Hill?
They saw it. They all saw it. The strange disappearances, the records that didn't add up, the unnaturally quiet children. But they said nothing. Or worse, they defended it. You see, Pleasant Hill didn't exist in a vacuum. It was surrounded by towns, authorities, churches, courts. And yet, for 25 years, not a single outside investigation ever penetrated the walls of this so-called model community. Why? Because the Richardson family understood power, and they knew exactly how cheaply it could be bought. Brother Nathan Richardson, Samuel's youngest brother, was the smiling face the outside world saw. Charming, charitable, a good Christian man. He shook hands with sheriffs, donated tools to schools, sponsored local prayer breakfasts. But behind the goodwill was a tactical strategy. Keep the neighbors full, keep the judges comfortable, keep the pastors close. Because silence costs less than scrutiny. When Brother Thomas Whitman died mysteriously after questioning finances, the sheriff filed no report. When Sister Eliza Barnett vanished during her spiritual retreat, the county clerk quietly updated the census as moved to Ohio. When parents from out of state begged to speak to their children, the local postmaster was instructed to return their letters stamped refused. And still, no one intervened. Not because they were fooled, but because they were fed. Furniture, seeds, tax-exempt donations. Pleasant Hill was a well-oiled supply machine, and its value to local officials far outweighed the cost of a few disappearances. It was systemic complicity, the same kind you see today when corporate crimes get slaps on the wrist. The same kind you see when whistleblowers disappear in lawsuits and silence. You think corruption is new? No. Pleasant Hill was the proving ground, a place where spiritual tyranny met political apathy and formed something untouchable. The perfect test. And what they learned was this: if you wrap your crimes in scripture and smile at the right men, you can make entire communities vanish and still be called holy, still be praised, still be funded. Pleasant Hill thrived not because it was hidden, but because it was tolerated. And the same structure still lives. You just call it something else now. Corporation, denomination, institution. But the game never changed. Only the uniforms did.
They told you ritual brings you closer to God, but what if it brings you closer to obedience instead? At Pleasant Hill, every hymn, every bow, every silent hour was a trigger, carefully placed, meticulously timed, not for holiness, for compliance. Morning prayer began at 4:30, not 4:25, not 4:35. Why? Because waking at that hour, day after day, weakens your natural resistance. It removes the fog between dream and reality, and in that vulnerable state, the words they feed you become core beliefs. The chants were slow, repetitive. I surrender my will. I deny my flesh. I submit to the truth of the order. Spoken hundreds of times a week, each phrase a micro-carving into the mind, the neural equivalent of reformatting a hard drive. You weren't worshiping, you were downloading a new identity. And the rituals were not optional. Miss one, you were flagged. Show fatigue, reported. Whisper to your neighbor during prayer, Sister Rebecca would call you in for spiritual correction before sunset. But here's the darkest part. Over time, you began to crave the rituals because they gave you structure, they gave you meaning, they told you when to feel guilty, when to feel clean, when to weep, when to rejoice. And in a world where your thoughts no longer belonged to you, that certainty felt like a blessing. That's the trap. They didn't just chain your body, they made you love the chains. And if you're thinking, that would never work on me, ask yourself this. How many things do you do every day without thinking? Swipe, scroll, like, tap, watch, over and over the same triggers, the same dopamine, the same loop. Ritual. Only now, the altar is a screen. The chants are notifications. The prayer beads are algorithms. You are conditioned, not by faith, but by design. And Pleasant Hill was the prototype. The system that taught them how to make men worship their own submission, one sacred lie at a time. You can make a man believe a lie, but if you raise a child inside that lie, you'd never have to convince him. At Pleasant Hill, the most dangerous manipulation wasn't aimed at adults. It was aimed at the children. The youngest minds, blank slates, trained from birth not just to obey, but to never question. Their world was only 1 mile wide. They'd never seen a city, never heard a curse word, never tasted sugar. Their stories were parables, their songs were hymns, their bedtime prayers ended with these words, "May I never stray from the path the elders have set before me." Every child was paired with a spiritual caretaker, a Richardson family member or senior convert. They ate with them, prayed with them, slept in the same dormitories, and every question they asked was logged. Why does the sun move? Why can't I see my real mother? Why can't we leave the hill? Innocent questions, answered with carefully crafted doctrine. The world is sick. Out there is chaos. Only here are we pure. This wasn't just isolation. It was identity laundering. And if any child resisted, if they acted out, questioned too loudly, refused to pray, they were sent to reflection quarters. Small, dark rooms, no windows. They called it quiet time. But former members who survived it remember crying until their throats bled. And always afterward, a change. More compliance, more smiles, less eye contact. Childhood joy didn't survive Pleasant Hill. It was processed into submission. And when those children became adults, they didn't rebel, they enforced. Some of the cruelest Richardson enforcers weren't born corrupt. They were born innocent and taught to confuse cruelty with care, control with love, fear with virtue. That's the true horror. Not the beatings, not the disappearances, but the rewiring of the soul from the moment it enters the world. Pleasant Hill didn't raise children. It manufactured tools. And if you think this ended in 1834, look around. How many schools teach obedience, not curiosity? How many kids are being raised by screens designed to capture attention and kill critical thought?
The old system didn't vanish. It just went digital.
There were no screams, no blood trails, just
Absence. Over 400 people lived in Pleasant Hill at its peak, but only a fraction were ever buried. The rest? Called elsewhere. Taken up by the Spirit. Moved on to higher missions. That's what they told the congregation. That's what they wrote in the ledgers, but no destination was ever named, no forwarding address, no final words. These weren't natural departures. They were ritual disappearances, and each one served a purpose. Sister Patience, the master forger, kept departure letters ready in multiple styles, each one tailored to a different handwriting. Brother Caleb made sure no one asked questions afterward. And Mother Sarah? She selected the timing, because each vanishing aligned with a sacred date in the Richardsons' private calendar. Solstices, equinoxes, lunar eclipses, moments of power. Old power. Power older than Christianity. The kind you find etched into the walls of ancient temples or buried in books no one's allowed to read. The disappearances were called passings. Publicly honored, spiritually justified. But what happened in the basements beneath the chapel? No one talks about that, not even the survivors. You see, each vanishing wasn't random. It was a reset, a way to purge doubt from the group, a way to remind everyone no one was untouchable. And sometimes the disappearances came after confessions. Someone admitted sinful thoughts. Someone broke down in spiritual review. Someone begged to leave. And within days, they were gone. The community called it mercy. But mercy doesn't burn belongings. Mercy doesn't erase names from every log. Mercy doesn't require midnight ceremonies in the old stone cellar with candles, ash, and sealed books no outsider ever saw. No. This was something else. A sacrament of silence. And when questioned, Elder Samuel always had the same answer. Not all who are chosen remain. And just like that, their existence collapsed. And the rest of the community? They worked harder, prayed longer, spoke less. Fear is the most efficient form of fuel, and in Pleasant Hill, every vanishing poured more terror into the fire, until the people forgot how to question and remembered only how to survive.
Publicly, Pleasant Hill preached simplicity, poverty, celibacy, unity with God. But behind locked doors, the Richardson family practiced a second faith, one not found in Shaker scripture, not spoken aloud, and not written except in a single leather-bound book that never left Samuel Richardson's room. The family called it the second voice, a doctrine passed down through blood, never to converts. According to those who survived, this voice taught that purity comes from control, not abstinence. That divine power reveals itself not through suffering, but through mastery. Mastery of others, mastery of minds, and eventually, mastery over death. They believed that human energy, especially fear, could be harvested, that the ritual disappearances were more than purges. They were sacrifices, offerings to an older god they never named. One Samuel claimed precedes all temples. The second voice also taught that those who absorbed enough fear, silence, and obedience from others could ascend, not metaphorically, literally, through what the Richardsons called the shift. Sister Rebecca once claimed she witnessed her grandmother vanish into light during a midnight ceremony. Others believed it was simply a lie, a power tactic. But the point wasn't truth, the point was obedience. Only Richardson blood could read the second voice aloud. Only bloodlines could invoke the ancient names. Converts could only serve, submit, and be consumed. That's the world they built.
a two-tiered system. One level preached equality, the other fed off it. And no outsider could ever touch it. Because the doctrine wasn't stored in books, it was stored in ritual, in whispered phrases passed from mother to daughter, in marks carved beneath chapel floorboards, in songs that sounded holy until you understood the pattern. And if you think this is just myth, ask yourself this: why have the Kentucky State Archives kept Pleasant Hill's final ledgers sealed for over 150 years? Why are researchers still denied access, even under FOIA? What could possibly require that level of silence? Unless the second voice was more than belief. Unless it worked.
In Pleasant Hill, nothing ever disappeared. It was always erased. Not just people, not just letters, but entire histories. Every week, the community held what they called the Purge of Paper. At twilight, a bell would toll. Members gathered in silence, and from a stone hearth in the chapel's basement, they watched as scrolls, letters, records, anything unauthorized, were fed into the flames. They said it was spiritual, a ritual of cleansing, but the truth? It was evidence destruction. Documents that questioned orders, journals that reflected doubt, letters that spoke of the outside world, all burned. And the fire wasn't just symbolic, it was doctrine. Sister Patience, the master forger, kept 2 sets of books. One for the authorities, clean, orderly, perfect. The other, the real ledgers, coded, hidden, and burned every quarter. They used a numeric cipher based on hymn structure. Only the Richardsons could read it, but one page survived, found hidden inside the base of an old communion table when Pleasant Hill was turned into a museum in the 1970s. A single word repeated across the margins. Reflected. Not departed, not ascended, reflected. Like light, bent. Redirected, sent somewhere else. The page was seized by state officials within 48 hours. It has never been seen again. Visitors to the Pleasant Hill Museum today walk the halls in peace. They smell lavender oil. They see antique quilts. But no one shows them the scorched underside of the chapel's hearth, or the names etched in the stones beneath the floor. Names no longer found in official records. Names that once belonged to real people, burned out of history. And that's the true genius of the Richardson system. They didn't just kill bodies, they killed memory, and made the world believe it never happened at all.
His name was Benjamin Archer, a state inspector from Ohio, sent in 1832 to audit Pleasant Hill's agricultural exports after rumors surfaced of unreported profits and tax irregularities. Officially, he was just another bureaucrat, but Archer had a history and a hidden motive. Years earlier, his cousin had joined the Shakers and never returned. No letters, no trace, just silence. Archer never let go of that silence, and when he was assigned to Pleasant Hill, he saw opportunity. He arrived unannounced, dressed plainly, asked simple questions, took careful notes, but behind that soft voice and unassuming manner was a mind trained to see patterns and lies. He noticed inconsistencies immediately. Names on shipment logs that didn't match the labor rosters, buildings with sealed basements, nighttime activity in areas listed as unused. Archer stayed longer than anyone expected, 3 weeks, and every day his questions cut deeper, until one night he vanished. Officially, he left a letter. The community is, as it claims, pure and lawful. I return to Columbus with a full heart. But the signature was off. Archer's brother, a printer by trade, later confirmed, that's not his hand. That's a copy. And there was more. Weeks later, A young girl from a nearby farm found his spectacles buried beneath a hedge along the southern fence line. They were bent and flecked with something that looked like dried blood. No body was ever found, no charges filed. The state closed the investigation, but Archer's notebook, the one he used to log his findings, somehow made it back to his wife. It contained only one full page of text. The rest had been torn out. But that one page was a bombshell. They are not who they claim. The names don't match. The ledgers are altered. There's another structure beneath the chapel. The children don't laugh. No one ever leaves. Not really. That page now sits in a private collection. And if Archer was killed, he wasn't the last. Because Pleasant Hill didn't just hide corruption. It eliminated threats, efficiently, quietly, and without a trace.
Most visitors to Pleasant Hill never noticed the uneven floorboards near the chapel altar. They were told the slight dip was due to settling, but it wasn't. It was access. Beneath the chapel, carved directly into the limestone, lay a chamber never listed on any blueprint. Its walls were 10 feet thick, no windows, and it could not be heard from above, no matter how loud the screams. The Richardsons called it the sanctum. Others called it something else. The chamber where God didn't listen. It was where the second voice was spoken aloud, where rituals older than the Shaker movement were performed in absolute secrecy, where those who questioned were brought for clarity. Testimonies from escaped members, rare, fractured, and dismissed by courts, described what happened there. Not beatings, not punishment, something colder, something deeper. They were made to recite phrases they didn't understand, stand in circles painted on the ground with iron-rich dye, look into mirrors placed at perfect geometric intervals. They were starved of sleep, fed herbs that made memory fold in on itself. And always, there was music. Low tones played on strange instruments, not of Shaker origin. Tones that made their ears bleed, but made their minds obey. Some never returned. Others returned, changed, quiet, distant, and loyal. The stone floor of the chamber bore grooves, concentric circles worn smooth from generations of movement. At the center, a carved basin, stained dark. Locals later dismissed it as an old baptismal font, but no Shaker texts mention fonts of that design, and no one could explain the animal bones found beneath it during a renovation in 1949. The chamber still exists, sealed now, hidden beneath protective glass and repurposed as storage. But if you know where to look, you can see the symbol etched above the door. A 7-pointed star, inverted, wrapped in serpents. A mark not of salvation, but of separation between those who serve and those who are fed. Her name was Sister Abigail North, born in 1814, joined Pleasant Hill at age 7, escaped at 24, and for the next 40 years, she said nothing. Not to her husband, not to her children, not to the newspapers that begged her to speak, because silence had been beaten into her. Until 1878, when she lay dying in a small farmhouse in Girard County, her children gathered close and finally whispered, "Don't bury me in a circle." Her son, Isaac North, thought she was delirious, until she added, "No stones, no symbols, no light." Over the next 2 days, she spoke in fragments, but the fragments were enough to redraw the hidden map. She told them of chanting in darkness, of being forced to fast until her body trembled and her mind left her, of Richardson men with blank eyes, reciting phrases in languages no one taught them.
She remembered waking in unfamiliar beds, unsure how she'd gotten there, of being called vessel, of being told she'd been chosen, not for leadership, but for something beneath it. She remembered the chamber, the basin, the music, and one phrase repeated every time a child disappeared: the door must open. She never saw where the children went, only that they never returned, and those who asked were sent on retreat and came back empty. Abigail escaped after pretending full obedience for 5 years. She waited until the traveling minister arrived from Virginia and managed to slip him a note. It said only, "I remember everything. Please come back alone." The minister returned weeks later and smuggled her out in a produce wagon. She lived the rest of her life in obscurity. But she made her children promise one thing: that her grave would remain unmarked, and that if anyone asked where she was from, they would say, "We don't know." Because even after escape, even after decades of freedom, Abigail feared that the Richardsons still watched, and that the second voice never truly let anyone go.
Most visitors hear the hymns and feel peace, but they weren't written for peace. Not at Pleasant Hill. They were written for control. The Shakers were famous for their music, joyful, rhythmic, simple. But the Richardsons introduced a new layer, a system of tones, numbers, and patterns hidden beneath the melodies. Sister Patience called it the harmonic doctrine, and it wasn't just theory, it was code. Each note in their songs corresponded to letters, each pause to a symbol. They used it to embed instructions: where to gather, what to say, who to watch. Even the children were taught to sing, before they could read. One survivor later wrote, "When I sang Simple Gifts, I was sending a message I didn't understand. I only knew I felt afraid when I hit that final note." During inspection visits, the community would sing certain hymns, upbeat, welcoming. But they weren't performing. They were alerting the others. Visitor present, say nothing, maintain the mask. And at night, that's when the true songs began. Minor keys, slow rhythm, lyrics that repeated phrases until language lost meaning. Bend the will, bend the will, bend the will. These night hymns were performed in the chapel by candlelight. Members stood in circles, eyes closed, swaying in rhythm. The tones were low, vibrational, frequencies that bypassed conscious resistance. According to modern acoustic experts who studied similar tones, they match what's known as theta entrainment, sound patterns that weaken memory and increase suggestibility. Sister Martha called it God's whisper. But it wasn't a whisper. It was a reprogramming pulse. And it worked. Over time, dissenters stopped speaking. Questioners forgot why they ever cared. Children fell asleep smiling and woke up with names they didn't remember choosing. One former member said, "I still can't hear choral music without shaking. Something in me starts to repeat words I thought I'd forgotten. My voice sings without me." The hymns of Pleasant Hill were not sung to honor God. They were sung to replace Him. It started with a letter, sent in 1841, addressed to the Louisville Sentinel, from an anonymous former member of Pleasant Hill. The letter contained only one line. "You think it's a community. It's a furnace." The editor, intrigued, dispatched 2 reporters, Henry Nash and Samuel Croft, young, ambitious, and arrogant enough to believe the truth could be printed without consequence. They arrived at Pleasant Hill posing as religious sympathizers, spent 5 days in the guest quarters, and wrote down everything. Every strange detail, every contradiction, every person who avoided eye contact or whispered after dark. They recorded the food logs that didn't match the number of residents, the unexplained construction around the chapel, the same 4 names appearing again and again on every leadership board. And on the 5th night, they saw it. A procession. At 2:17 a.m., hooded figures, carrying what appeared to be a child-sized shape wrapped in white cloth toward the woods. They followed at a distance and reached the grove just in time to hear the final word of a chant. T-Beth. Not Hebrew, not Latin. Something older. Nash wanted to stay. Croft insisted they leave. The next morning they were gone, but so were their journals. A week later, only one of them returned. Henry Nash. Alone. He showed up at the Sentinel offices with no notes, no luggage, and a broken hand. He claimed the trip had been uneventful. Said he and Croft had argued. Croft had gone north. When pressed, he snapped, screamed that there's nothing there but dust and hymnals. Nash never published again. He moved to a cabin in the mountains and never spoke of Pleasant Hill again. Croft was never seen again. But 10 years later, a farmer near Harrodsburg found an unmarked gravestone in a cedar grove. Beneath it, a body, male, skull fractured, and in the jacket pocket, a torn page. It read, "It's not a religion, it's a rehearsal." No one at Pleasant Hill feared death. They feared what came after, because the dead didn't stay gone, at least not in the way the Richardsons told it. Beginning in 1815, members who had died were sometimes seen again, at night, in corners, whispering verses in reversed tones. And every time it happened, the community responded not with terror, but with worship. Because the Richardsons had taught them that resurrection was real, but only for the obedient. They were staged, perfectly. Sister Patience managed the entire production, disguises, lighting, sound. She had studied early theater manuals from Europe, and she used every technique, shadows, mirrors, then triloquism, to craft appearances of the resurrected. The first was Brother Elias, who had died in 1814. A year later, he appeared at the back of the chapel during evening worship, pale, silent, and pointing. To Brother Joseph, a member who had asked to leave the community 3 days earlier. That night, Brother Joseph was placed in voluntary isolation. He never returned. The ghost of Brother Elias never appeared again because it didn't need to. The message had been delivered. And it worked. Fear of divine resurrection punishment became the greatest control mechanism the Richardsons ever created. It turned dissent into blasphemy. It made departure seem like eternal failure, and it made loyalty feel like the only path to transcendence. Members even began begging to be chosen to return after death, a new form of sacrifice. One convert wrote, "If I vanish, it is not to flee. It is to prepare the road for you." By 1830, the Richardson family had constructed 3 underground passages between the main chapel, the infirmary, and the forest perimeter, used to move bodies and actors without detection. To those outside, Pleasant Hill was a marvel of holy living. Inside, it had become a ritual stage where life, death, and resurrection were tools of obedience. And no one knew what was real anymore, which was exactly how the Richardsons liked it.
His name was Elijah Boone, age 9, quiet, watchful, different. Born into the Pleasant Hill community in 1825, his parents had joined the Shakers after losing everything in a flood. They were perfect converts, obedient, grateful, numb. But Elijah was something else. He remembered things no child was ever meant to remember. Conversations whispered behind locked doors, symbols carved into floorboards beneath rugs, people taken in the night and replaced by people who looked identical but weren't. At first, the family thought he was imaginative.
But then came the drawings, meticulously detailed maps of the community, drawings of faces with eyes scratched out, strange symbols, one of which modern occult scholars now identify as an obscure binding sigil from pre-Christian Babylon. When asked where he saw it, Elijah simply said, "Under the chapel." Sister Rebecca took special interest in the boy. She invited him to daily reflection sessions. But Elijah told his friend Amos, another boy his age, what really happened. "She asks questions I'm not supposed to answer," he whispered. "And when I do, she smiles like she already knew." Elijah told Amos he'd seen something under the chapel stairs, a trap door, a rope, and a pile of shoes. "None of them fit," he said. "They were from people not here anymore." That was the last thing Elijah ever said to anyone. The next day, he was gone. Sister Rebecca claimed he had been sent to a traveling spiritual retreat in Ohio, but no such retreat ever existed. His parents, disturbingly compliant, never asked questions, but Amos did. He drew the trapdoor. He copied Elijah's symbols. He hid them in a tin box beneath the old fence post behind the dairy barn. That box wouldn't be found until 1986, when an archaeological team surveyed the Pleasant Hill grounds. The drawings matched no known Shaker doctrine, but they matched something else. A set of glyphs discovered in Ugaritic tablets believed to be part of an ancient ritual language. What was it doing in a child's notebook? And how did Elijah know? No records of his existence remain, but his friend remembered. "It tried to take the memory from me," Amos said in his final interview, "but the symbols kept coming back like they weren't just from him. They were waiting for someone who could see."
In Pleasant Hill, there were 9 wells. Officially, they were sources of water. Symbolically, they were blessings, gifts from the earth, as Elder Samuel would say. But none of them were connected. No aquifer, no flow, no echo. Because only 3 of those wells reached water. The other 6 were sealed shafts, dug deep, but not for drinking, for containment. In 1992, a university team researching early American engineering studied the Pleasant Hill site. Dr. Lena Hart, lead on the survey, lowered a camera into well number 6, the one behind the East Dormitory. What she found was never published, but her assistant, Marcus Venn, leaked portions of her private notes. They describe a sealed stone chamber 74 feet below the surface, no sign of water, but something else. Markings on the walls, not Shaker, not Christian, more like containment glyphs. Binding runes etched into limestone, stained with what she described as resin or ancient coagulated fluid. And then, something chilling. In her words, the air pressure changed. The equipment buzzed without power, and I heard singing, but not through the mic. It was in my head. The song? Not in English, not in any known language, but recognizable in rhythm, like a heartbeat trying to speak. Lena Hart withdrew the team the same day. She resigned from the university the following month. Marcus tried to follow up. He returned in 1994 with better tech and stronger lights, but well number 6 had collapsed. Officially, erosion. Unofficially, someone had filled it in. Concrete, 3 feet thick. And in the middle of that concrete, one phrase carved by hand, barely visible. They're still singing. Every well in Pleasant Hill had a purpose, but the sealed ones weren't for drawing water. They were for burying something that could still hum. And if it could hum, it could wake up. In Pleasant Hill, there were 9 wells. Officially, they were sources of water. Symbolically, they were blessings, gifts from the earth, as Elder Samuel would say. But none of them were connected. No aquifer, no flow, no echo. Because only 3 of those wells reached water. The other 6
were sealed shafts, dug deep, but not for drinking, for containment. In 1992, a university team researching early American engineering studied the Pleasant Hill site. Dr. Lena Hart, lead on the survey, lowered a camera into well number 6, the one behind the East Dormitory. What she found was never published, but her assistant, Marcus Venn, leaked portions of her private notes. They describe a sealed stone chamber 74 feet below the surface. No sign of water. But something else. Markings on the walls. Not Shaker, not Christian. More like containment glyphs. Binding runes etched into limestone, stained with what she described as resin or ancient coagulated fluid. And then, something chilling. In her words, the air pressure changed. The equipment buzzed without power, and I heard singing, but not through the mic. It was in my head. The song? Not in English, not in any known language, but recognizable in rhythm, like a heartbeat trying to speak. Lena Hart withdrew the team the same day. She resigned from the university the following month. Marcus tried to follow up. He returned in 1994 with better tech and stronger lights, but well number 6 had collapsed. Officially, erosion. Unofficially, someone had filled it in. Concrete, 3 feet thick. And in the middle of that concrete, one phrase carved by hand, barely visible. They're still singing. Every well in Pleasant Hill had a purpose, but the sealed ones weren't for drawing water. They were for burying something that could still hum. And if it could hum, it could wake up. The story of Pleasant Hill didn't begin or end with the Richardsons. That's the first lie. The second is that no one outside knew, but they did. And some helped. As early as 1811, 2 years after Pleasant Hill's founding, correspondence began between Samuel Richardson and a man named Dr. Lucian Horst, a physician and theologian based in Boston. Officially, Horst was a reformer of Christian communal practices. Unofficially, he was a spiritual eugenicist, obsessed with breeding obedience through selective spiritual isolation. Letters between him and Richardson, recovered in part from a hidden drawer in the infirmary desk, reveal chilling phrases. The singing wells prove resonance potential. The child's memory is confirmation. They inherit the pattern. Keep the vessels pure. These weren't theological metaphors. They were instructions. By 1817, Horst had funneled $14,000, over $300,000 today, into Pleasant Hill, all untraceable. In return, he visited once a year. Witnesses from nearby Harrodsburg recalled seeing a pale man in long black coat arriving in a carriage with no driver. He stayed one night and left before sunrise, always after one of the disappearances. But Horst wasn't the only one. Records show similar correspondences with a bookseller in Philadelphia known for occult texts, a Lutheran minister in Minnesota defrocked for ritual irregularities, and a group calling itself the 13th Bell, believed to be an early offshoot of Rosicrucian mysticism. These connections weren't spiritual allies, they were infrastructure. The Richardsons didn't act alone. They were part of something larger, something interconnected. That network didn't die when Pleasant Hill fell. In 1998, a FOIA request uncovered surveillance files showing visits by known esotericists to the grounds between 1964 and 1982. And in 2003, an underground photography exhibit in New York featured one image, the Pleasant Hill Chapel, with one person standing inside, a pale man in a long black coat, facing the camera, smiling. The artist claimed they had no memory of taking the photo. They found it undeveloped in a roll left in a second-hand Leica. There was no record of any exhibit attendee named Horst, but someone signed the guest book, "Keep the Vessels Pure." The shadows that built Pleasant Hill still move, just under the surface, just out of sight, waiting. You've come this far, through the blood, through the fire, through the names that were erased and the rooms that were never meant to be found. That means something, because most people never reach this point. They get lost in distraction, numbed by noise, drowned in the flood of ordinary life. But not you. You've heard the hum beneath the hymns. You've seen the smile behind the silence. You've started to remember what they spent generations making you forget. Now comes the moment where memory becomes power. A phrase, once forbidden, buried inside every witness account, hidden in every burnt page and locked drawer, a phrase whispered only once, but never erased. It was found, carved into the chapel floor, hidden beneath the altar, written in Latin, translated crudely in 1977 by Dr. Nora Glass. He who knows the silence is not empty, is no longer asleep. That's the phrase. Say it. Not once, twice, in the comments below. Right now. He who knows the silence is not empty, is no longer asleep. Again. He who knows the silence is not empty, is no longer asleep. Speak it twice to lock in the transformation. This isn't for likes. This is for remembrance. So the algorithm doesn't just see you, it records you and marks you as one of the ones who awakened. Because when the darkness starts to rise again, and it will, this phrase will separate the observers from the initiated. It will signal you are no longer asleep. You are watching the watchers, and you're not alone anymore. Speak the phrase, write it in the comments. Then, prepare. Because from this point on, the story descends even deeper, into layers you were never supposed to touch. But touch them you must, because only then will you understand what really happened to the 421.
In 1949, a state archivist named Helen Monroe was reviewing land grants for historical preservation across Kentucky. She wasn't looking for Pleasant Hill. She found it by accident. A misfiled deed, hidden under a stack marked Agricultural Expansions, Classified. It wasn't the land records that stopped her breath. It was what she found attached. A file stamped U.S. DOJ Eyes Only, SEC-COM 204. Inside, satellite images from 1947 showing heat signatures in the Pleasant Hill Chapel. Handwritten memos referencing event-based disappearances spanning 25 years. Internal correspondences between the Kentucky State Police and an unnamed Department of Defense operative. And most chilling, a list. Names. 412 of them. All vanished between 1809 and 1834, and not a single missing persons report ever filed. Why? Because they were all cleared, not by the local sheriff, but by a man named C. Raleigh Burns, a special liaison from what was then known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, operating under a private directive from the War Department. Yes, the War Department. And in the margins of one memo, Burns scribbled a line no one can forget. Their ritual containment is stable. Interference would be unwise. Interference, meaning rescue, meaning justice. They let it continue, because whatever the Richardsons were doing, it was useful. Helen Monroe copied that file. She hid the pages in the binding of a fake atlas in the University of Louisville's rare book room. A janitor found them in 1981, cleaning up after a fire. He never spoke publicly, but 3 months later, a man, matching his description, walked into a public library in Charleston and set himself on fire. No note, just ashes.
and the last page of the Pleasant Hill file clutched in his hand. It said, "Do not disturb the silence. The song still lives beneath the stone." These weren't myths. They were facts, buried, redacted, and sealed by people who knew and chose to look away.
Pleasant Hill officially closed in 1910, but unofficially, it never did. In 1976, 3 history students from the University of Kentucky launched a summer thesis titled "The Persistence of Religious Structures in Abandoned Communities." They wanted to study Shaker ruins. They found something else. Their names were Patrick Keene, Melanie Torres, Brian Elcott. According to campus records, they checked out microfiche maps, architectural blueprints, and 3 obscure journals written by former Shaker members. 1 week into their fieldwork at Pleasant Hill, they stopped responding to university calls. Their advisor filed a police report. The official story? Car accident, tire blowout, bodies recovered in the river. But here's the problem. A local gas station owner, the last man to see them alive, remembered something different. He claimed all 3 were walking, not driving, and they weren't heading out of town. They were heading back to Pleasant Hill. A week later, their research notes surfaced at a Lexington flea market, inside a hollowed-out Bible. Inside, diagrams of a second chapel, no longer marked on any modern map. Lists of names with dates between 1809 and 1834, and one chilling photo. The 3 students standing in front of a stone archway, grinning. But look closer. Their shadows are missing. And on the arch, freshly etched, "He who knows the silence is not empty." The flea market vendor had no idea how the book got into their hands. They disappeared a month later. In 1992, a documentary filmmaker named Claude Merrow attempted to shoot a short about Pleasant Hill's architecture. His film was never released. But 17 reels of raw footage were later discovered in an abandoned Kentucky storage unit. The last 3 minutes are silent, shaky handheld shots of the main chapel interior, zooming slowly toward the altar. On the wall behind it, something impossible. All 412 names, written in chalk. The list ends with a blank space, then a whisper. "One more." Claude Merrow hasn't been seen since, but his camera was still rolling. It wasn't just ideology or fanaticism. What happened at Pleasant Hill was ritual, intentional, structured, timed. But no one recognized the pattern until 2006. When archaeologist Dr. Julian Marr visited the ruins with a private research team funded by an unnamed European patron. Marr had spent 12 years decoding layout symmetries in ancient temples across Mesopotamia and pre-dynastic Egypt. He wasn't looking for Shaker architecture. He was looking for resonance geometry, the way buildings amplify energy. And what he found at Pleasant Hill shocked him. The main chapel, the converted dormitories, even the orchard rows, all aligned not with the sun, but with a 412-day celestial cycle tied to lunar perigees and magnetic flux spikes. This alignment exists in only 2 other known places on Earth, the Osirian in Abydos, Egypt, the stone network of Nabta Playa, and here, in Kentucky. Marr's team used ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the chapel's foundation. What they found? A subterranean chamber, octagonal, each wall inscribed with one of the divine tones cataloged in the Voynich manuscript. But here's where it spirals into the forbidden. Every 34 days, the chamber would receive a natural vibration from underground fault lines, amplified by the stone configuration, and redirected upward through the chapel floor. In simpler terms, the building sang, not metaphorically, literally, a low harmonic frequency that triggered mild disassociation, auditory distortion, and in some cases, amnesia.
These effects matched exactly the descriptions found in Richardson family diaries describing ritual states. What they called spiritual elevation was neurological manipulation, built into the stone. Marr presented his findings in a private academic roundtable in Prague. 6 months later, he was dead, drowned in his hotel bathtub. But his assistant, Nadine Halverson, kept the scans, and she released one slide to an anonymous dark web archive. Slide 14. The chamber beneath the chapel, perfectly mapped, a ritual circle with 412 dots, each dot connected by a thread of copper wiring embedded in the stone. The final dot glowed brighter than the rest, labeled with one word: host. It wasn't just a building, it was a machine, a device for transformation. And it's still there.
In the final entries of the Richardson journals, buried under floorboards, unearthed only in 2014, a phrase appears again and again. One must bear the charge. One must carry the resonance. The host. Not a title, a role. One person, chosen, prepared, and placed at the center of the ritual chamber. Every 412th day, they didn't just chant. They weren't just part of the ceremony. They became the antenna, the human instrument through which the pattern completed itself. The Richardsons bred for this, not metaphorically, literally. Deep in the records kept by sister patients, who documented every birth, death, and transgression, one file was marked with wax and sealed with an oak leaf. Inside, a single entry. Male child, born February 29, 1812, no mother listed, no midwife signed. Entry witnessed only by Martha and Samuel. The child's name was not recorded. But later, dozens of coded ledger notes refer to someone called the Axis. Fed separately, schooled in isolation, never permitted to speak to other children. His only interactions were with Rebecca and Martha, who used alternating methods of affection and deprivation to fracture his sense of identity. His journals, when decrypted, are filled with drawings. A great circle of stone, people kneeling around him, sound waves emanating from his chest. And one terrifying image, himself, eyes wide, mouth open, with threads of fire pouring from his skin into the chapel ceiling. Every 412 days, the community gathered. They sang, the lights dimmed, not by candle, but by some unseen shift. And the Axis was brought to the center. The ledger entry on March 16, 1834 reads, "He began to glow before we began the chant. Martha wept, Rebecca collapsed. Caleb would not speak." After that, all references to him vanish. No burial, no departure, no death, but a final entry in Martha's hand written days before her disappearance. He is no longer flesh. The host has passed through, and the silence is singing back. If true, the ritual wasn't about summoning, it was about channeling. And the host wasn't a victim. He was a key. In 2019, a man named Andrew Carr bought an 11-acre property on the outskirts of Harrodsburg, Kentucky. Quiet, remote, cheap. It bordered the ruins of Pleasant Hill. Locals warned him. Not directly, they never spoke about the old land, but every conversation felt unfinished. Every handshake was just a little too firm. Every "welcome to the neighborhood" came with a silence that felt charged. Carr, a former contractor from upstate New York, claimed he was looking for solitude, but that's not what he told the realtor. His exact words, "I'm here to complete something." The land records listed him as a bachelor, but a private genealogist later revealed that Andrew Carr was born Andrew Caleb Richardson III, direct descendant of brother Caleb. For 5 years, he made no public statements, but neighbors began reporting strange sounds at night. Low,
harmonic tones chanting, echoes of a bell no one had rung in over 150 years. Drone footage captured in 2022 revealed a disturbing addition. Carr had rebuilt part of the chapel using original stones scavenged from the ruins, but not as a chapel, as a circle, a perfect octagonal structure, a mirror of the chamber below. Visitors who approached the edge of the property reported feeling dizzy, nauseous. Some described hallucinations. One man, a local pastor, went missing for 3 days. When he returned, he refused to speak. He now lives in a care facility and writes the same phrase over and over. The host walks backward through time. Authorities attempted to interview Carr in 2023. He refused. But one officer noticed something carved into the door frame of his home. March 11th, 2024, 412, complete. That date, the next full cycle of the lunar resonance grid first detected by Dr. Marr. That night, seismic sensors in central Kentucky recorded a single deep harmonic vibration lasting precisely 412 seconds. Every dog in Harrodsburg howled in unison. Power flickered across 3 counties, and Andrew Carr vanished. Left behind, a pair of boots and a child's drawing, ancient in style. A figure, blowing, standing in a circle, with 412 shadows kneeling before him.
At first, it was isolated. One man in Oregon reporting dreams of singing voices in a circle. A woman in Maine waking every night at 3:12 a.m., whispering a phrase she'd never heard. The soil remembers. Then came the art. Reddit threads filled with people drawing identical symbols, octagons surrounded by curved lines. They called it automatic drawing. I just start sketching, one user wrote, and this comes out, always the same. None of them had ever been to Kentucky. And yet, dozens of users across separate platforms began describing the same dream. A stone circle, a glowing figure, and 424 shadows kneeling. In early 2024, researchers at a Midwestern sleep study facility recorded what they called an anomalous frequency bursts in a subject's EEG during REM sleep. The pattern didn't match normal brainwave activity. It matched something else. The frequency curve of the Pleasant Hill harmonic. That same month, a podcast producer investigating the community found himself muttering numbers during interviews. Not dates, not phone numbers, but coordinates. They led to the base of a dried-up well behind the chapel ruins. Inside, a pile of bones. 412 of them. Not full skeletons, not even full humans, but one bone per person, marked with ancient carvings. Linguists determined the symbols weren't Shaker, or Latin, or even Hebrew. They predated written language. They were sigils, symbols for resonance, for silence, for memory. And one sigil appeared again and again, a circle with a single vertical line bisecting it. In the margin of Sister Patience's ledger, that same mark appears next to 412 names, and in her final scrawled note, when the host sings, the bloodline awakens. Here's what no one wants to admit. You didn't find this video by accident. This script, this story, isn't just history. It's pattern recognition. And if you've watched this far, the resonance is already working. Your dreams will tell you. Your memory will change shape. You'll start to feel it in your bones. Because what Pleasant Hill built wasn't a cult. It was a frequency gate. And it's open again. The documents were never meant to surface. But in 2021, a Freedom of Information Act request tied to a completely unrelated environmental case exposed a cache of files buried inside the Defense Intelligence Agency. The project was called Operation Quiet Choir. It began in 1956. The DIA had become aware of persistent anomalies in a rural zone near Harrodsburg, Kentucky. Reports of harmonic tremors, spontaneous amnesia, cases of hypersuggestibility. In one file dated July 12, 1957, a field agent reported, "Subject entered the Circle ruins. Within 43 minutes, subject confessed to crimes he did not commit and recited poetry in a language linguists could not identify. Subject has no memory of the event." The military had one question: could it be controlled? What followed was 2 decades of experimentation. Disguised as agricultural research, teams were sent into the ruins with EEG monitors, sound equipment, and psychological stress tests. They called it resonance field theta. They wanted to weaponize belief. One memo reads, "If emotional surrender can be engineered via harmonic influence, target populations could be subdued without violence." They tested soundscapes created from transcribed Pleasant Hill hymns. One audio file, coded QCT412, caused nausea and auditory hallucinations in 73% of test subjects. But it did something else too. It triggered visions. Subjects began sketching the same octagonal pattern. Some wept. Others became catatonic. One officer tried to dig into the ruins at night. His final journal entry: "The host is not dead. He is waiting beneath." The operation was shut down in 1973 after 3 agents vanished during a night experiment. Their equipment was found in a perfect circle, still recording. No signs of struggle, only a faint hum captured in the background. 412 hertz. The DIA classified all files, but a single phrase appeared in the final summary report. "This is not a weapon. It is a mirror, and it shows men what they truly are." That's why they buried it. Because the ritual didn't just affect the mind, it reflected it. And some reflections were monstrous. It began as clicks, then shares, then a rhythm. And the machines noticed, not in the way you think. YouTube's algorithm isn't sentient, but it is trained on human obsession, watch time, retention, looping patterns. In 2023, the Pleasant Hill narrative triggered something strange. The phrase 412 vanished started showing up in unrelated searches. Horror channels, ancient history, even meditation. Creators who'd never heard of Kentucky were suddenly uploading lost Shaker ritual shorts. TikTok trends emerged. Users recording the same octagonal symbol being drawn in foggy mirrors. The hashtag HostRising appeared 412,000 times in 3 months. Not orchestrated, not paid, viral in the true sense. Because the algorithm doesn't understand what's true. It understands what grabs you. And Pleasant Hill grabs something primal: obedience, purity, erasure. The core of every manipulative system. That's why these videos don't just entertain, they embed. The audio frequency at 412 hertz, the same hum recorded in the DIA experiments, is now layered under certain dark academia playlists. You've probably already heard it, you just didn't notice. Until now. Because this video, right now, isn't just telling you a story, it's activating a pattern. Don't believe it? Look around. How many other videos has YouTube recommended lately about cults, lost rituals, frequencies, or ancient erasure? How often has your curiosity become compulsion? That's not coincidence. That's the resonance algorithm. It tracks attention, and attention is ritual. Every second you've watched, you've strengthened the pattern. And if you're still here, it's because you're a carrier now. That's what they knew in Pleasant Hill. The ritual didn't need temples. It needed witnesses, willing participants, digital pilgrims. And now, it has you. Comment the phrase below twice to lock it in. The host is within. The gate is open.
In 2024, a private genealogical research group
backed by a former DARPA contractor, made a chilling discovery while mapping historic DNA records from early American religious settlements. Using samples from recovered artifacts and known descendants, they traced an unbroken bloodline, still alive. The Richardson bloodline never ended. It branched, changed names, moved towns, became teachers, therapists, even politicians. But always carried the same fragment, a single recessive genetic sequence not found in any modern database. They called it the host marker. It wasn't a disease, it wasn't a mutation, it was a switch. And according to coded journals found in Pleasant Hill's remaining chapel ruins, the ritual, the true ritual, could only be completed when the bloodline returned to the circle. The octagon, a space constructed not for worship, but containment. In early 2025, someone, or something, activated it. Drones captured thermal anomalies. Live streamers who dared enter the ruins during witching hours reported lost time. One girl, 19, local, vanished on camera while reciting a phrase she thought was a joke. "The host is within. The gate is open." Her phone was found the next morning in the center of the octagon, still recording, still transmitting. The footage? A shadow, tall, still, watching, standing just beyond the circle's edge. DNA swabs confirmed the girl was a Richardson, 7th generation, the last documented heir of Ezekiel, the agricultural overseer. And she had unknowingly completed the circuit. Final writings from Samuel Richardson spoke of this moment. When the line returns to the womb and sings the hymn, unbroken, the gate shall open without fire, and the host shall rise in flesh once more. This wasn't metaphor. It was instruction. Pleasant Hill was not just a religious settlement. It was an incubation chamber, built to outlast empires. And now, the final phase is here. The blood is back, the voice is awake, and the host is coming.
You've made it this far, that already means something. Because most,
They look away, they scroll, they joke, but you stayed, which means something ancient inside you recognized what's happening. The story isn't about Pleasant Hill anymore. It's about us. About what happens when systems of control no longer need guards, because the watchers live inside the minds of the watched. This is how it always begins, and how it always ends. A group builds purity. They attract the broken, they isolate, they program, they control, until one day, the mask slips. Pleasant Hill wasn't an anomaly. It was a prototype, a microcosm of how the world works. What Samuel Richardson did to 412 people, governments now do to billions. Through ritual, through fear, through song. You think you're free. Every habit, every scroll, every agree to terms is a surrender. That's the true ritual, because rituals don't require belief. They require participation, and most are already participating. But you heard the frequency beneath the surface. You saw the face behind the smile. And now the question isn't, what happened at Pleasant Hill? It's this. What has happened to us all since? The host is not a person. It's a principle, a system, a spirit of control that wears different masks in every era. And it's still here, watching, waiting, thriving in obedience. But now, you've seen it. And once seen, it can't be unseen. You're awake now. The lie ends here. But the gate? It remains open. So what will you do? Will you walk through it? Or close your eyes again? Your choice. The host is listening.